Who's ready to talk zero RB with Mr. Zero RB himself, Shawn Siegele? That's what we're going to do on today's episode. Obviously, we talk zero RB all the time on the podcast, but Shawn, the zero RB list just hits differently. And I joke about this all the time, but it's the most questions I get, like for any specific article throughout the year. And it's always like, people message, and I don't want to bug you, but when is it coming out? When is it? And I'm like, I'm going to ask Shawn. So it is out. 3 parts as normal, 15 candidates ready to erupt in 2023. So that is what we're going to do. I know how much work Shawn puts into this every single year, and I know he wants the players to succeed for the RotoViz community, for the subscribers, for everyone that uses the list. So the question I ask Shawn each and every time is, does it feel like there's a weight lifted off your shoulders at this point after you've got it out there into the wider world?
Yes and no, because, as soon as it's out, then you're watching the news. Because some of these guys there's a wide range of outcomes, right? There's contingency-based plays.
One positive move can change it so quickly, and one negative move can change it in the complete opposite direction.
It can. I had one player on here who I mentioned usually would probably be on the watch list instead of the countdown itself. And then within the first 24 hours after releasing, the situation for him, at least, again, on the surface, got a lot better to where I've been loading up on him in drafts. By contrast, there are 2 players who I think have actually been hit pretty hard, even just in the last 3 or 4 days, and now are more or less do not drafts. And so that part is tricky. And I always like to do an update if I have time, certainly if there is news that is going to really move some of these players. And so this week there will be an update for everyone drafting on the big Labor Day weekend. But yeah, Colm, it was a wait, but it was so much fun. It was such a great experience to write this season. And, when you go through some years where people are asking, when's it coming out? When's it coming out? It reinforces to you that you better do a good job, right? You better take it seriously. So I was joking with someone that the write-ups for each of the 15 guys have gotten a little bit longer, and it is important to do it in 3 parts. Otherwise it would be extremely long. But it was a labor of love. And I think that, working through it is always very helpful for me, both for the guys that I am really strongly recommending, and then some of the players where I want people to understand just what the upside would be if that guy hit.
Yeah.
Connor was joking with me that one of the write-ups on here was the most lukewarm recommendation he'd ever seen on the list. And I thought that was both funny, accurate, and then also it reflected kind of what I was going through when I was trying to pick that guy and sort of, arguably the last person to go on the list. One of the things here that is always a little bit tricky is how many players do we want to put from an individual team if we're actually loading up on the team kind of across the board. And the 3 teams this year that really fit that category would be the Chicago Bears, the Philadelphia Eagles, the Miami Dolphins, because they have multiple interesting players, all of whom are relatively cheap due to the fact that they have multiple interesting players. But you do expect the individual guys to score when they get a chance, because in all 3 of those cases, the actual running backs on the roster do seem very talented. And then the offenses themselves also seem like they're going to score a lot of points. And so you want to have some exposure there. You can put all the guys on, you can leave all the guys off, you can split the difference. And so working through that is interesting. How many of those people do you want to include? And then where are you going to go for some of these extra ones? But Colm, today we're going to look at, I think, 3 specific names. Last week we did a show talking about big picture. How do you find these guys? What are the profiles? What are the traits that we're really looking for? So if you want to do it yourself and you don't necessarily, not that you don't buy my research, but you want it to be your team and you feel like you have the best chance of finding the guys who are right for you, we have that show out there for you so you can figure out how to do it for yourself. But today we're going to look at 3 and Colm just kind of, taking a step back and appreciating not just the fact that the zero RB list is out and done, but there are a bunch of other fantastic articles out on the site over the last week. Matt Irby, one of our new writers, doing a fantastic job. Bjorn Yang Burnett has been absolutely extraordinary with his work this offseason. We're about to get a new article by Blair today. Curtis Patrick released his Hero RB guide and roster construction preferences. Jake Bowes has been another new writer for us who's doing some really cool work with Best Ball ADP. I mean, I'm obviously biased, but having been, with the site for 11 years, I mean, this might be our best week of content we've had. And so it's been a lot of fun. I'm really enjoying 2023, as you know.
Shawn bringing the fire, possibly the best week of content on RotoViz in its history. That's one of the people come for Shawn's bold takes. That is a bold take for all the stuff that's coming. But it's always awesome to see new writers join the site, see their journey, see how they work through their processes, and fantastic stuff all week. And I do agree with Shawn. The content is second to none. Shawn, lots of challenges when you're doing this list, and some of that is, we've talked a lot about the change in running back landscape and how things have changed in terms of ADP, how that may also affect who qualifies on this list because of where players are now going. But you did mention at the show we did last week talking about how to find those players, those profiles. I would highly recommend it. We also did a FFPC Main Event draft, which is now available as well. So I would say head on over and check that out. Shawn has been running a contest to draft with him over at the FFPC. I will be doing the draw today, and I will be getting in touch with the winner. So good luck to everyone who has participated. We have been blown away by the reviews, the amount of reviews for both the Stealing Bananas podcast and the RotoViz Overtime podcast on different podcast feeds and so on. But it's been amazing, Shawn, to get that response. But we will be announcing the winners on a future show. I'll be reaching out to them this week. Shawn will be drafting with them. And we are working on something that Shawn brought to me before today's show, which would be very, very exciting if we make it happen. So not able to announce it as of yet, but stay tuned to my Twitter feed, which is at Overtime Ireland this week, to see potential more details. And I would also say to subscribe to the RotoViz YouTube channel, because we are currently just a couple of clicks away from 2,500 subscribers over there. But Shawn, that's enough plugs there to get it out of the way. But let's get into the zero RB list. I think we start with part 1 technically, which is 15 through 11.
So Colm, these are players you can draft toward the end of your drafts. And again, you want to know what ADP you're looking at, what the price ranges are for your specific league. I dropped a home league draft plan last week, and Matt wrote some really cool pieces that give you great targets for home leagues as well. When we're thinking about FFPC redraft leagues, we're going to see different prices in that, say, running back 50 range than you are in Underdog, where obviously the, QB2 tier is pulled way up because of the structure of best ball. So you want to make sure you understand where you're going to draft these guys. But these are players who are going toward the end. Colm, out of these 5 players, do you have a personal favorite that we can break down on the show today?
I do. And Shawn, as we go through this, I know you're going to ask me which is my favorite in each list, and it may be a little bit of a cop-out, but I tend to think that the guys who are the top name on each list are the guys that are probably going to be the most interesting to talk about. I think it's number 11, Tyjae Spears. I think really, I still think Derrick Henry has stuff left in those legs, but when you look about the player, the profile, even, when we want to balance out what's happening in preseason, but any concerns that we may have had about Spears and his, health and his knees and so on and so forth, he's been able to show that he is translating to the NFL level instantly. They're in a team who is going to be pretty much a run-first offense moving into play action, and you're in a situation where I think there'll be standalone value for him. We've seen him with some of that explosiveness in the preseason, but look, we don't want injuries to Derrick Henry, but an aging running back, lots of tread on the tires. If he is to miss time, Tyjae Spears just becomes such a massive, massive boom for any team that would have him on their roster.
And you select Spears there. He is a personal favorite of mine as well. I think he is my number 1 player in Underdog in total exposures.
Number 1, hit me with a percentage approximately.
Well, he's fallen down below 40% now, because in the last...
Fallen below 40%.
Right. And that's over about 65 drafts.
Yeah.
So it's not an insubstantial number of drafts. He's gotten a little bit trendier as of late. And one of the reasons that I am not overly worried about the really high exposures in the first, half to 2/3 of draft season is that you anticipate those guys getting more expensive and not really fitting as well down the stretch.
Yeah.
So I may not get too much of him the rest of the way. But you look at him, and the reason that I have so much is I have him undervalued by about 4 rounds. And when that's the case, he's often the top guy available to you when you're looking for a running back late. His situation there behind Derrick Henry, I don't think is that much different or that much worse than the situation of Charbonnet behind Walker, of Bigsby behind ETN. In some ways, you could argue that it's better because those other backs are behind young stars, whereas Derrick Henry, could be at the end. You say maybe that matters a little bit more for dynasty than it does for redraft. But one of the things that people tend to forget when they're playing redraft, and one of the reasons why the 0 RB list has always been so effective, is that whatever trend you expect to eventually play out in dynasty has to happen in an actual year. That's a redraft year, right? And when it does, that's when you win. So to have that kind of a thesis for Spears, though, we do need to have him as an elite talent. And you go through there, you got a 201-pound back, small school, spends 4 years in college. So what are we looking at as the positives here? He's got a high breakaway rush score. I mentioned him in contrast to Tyjae here because that was a player with some similar health concerns.
Yep.
But the breakaway rushes, you'd love to see. He's got an 85th percentile backfield dominator rating. And that's 3rd best among the serious prospects. Again, encouraging sign for a guy who has size and maybe competition concerns. 90th percentile explosion score, that 39-inch vertical in there. Averaged almost 7 yards per attempt in college, including 6.9 over 222 attempts his final year. His stuff rate is good. His after contact average last year was above Bijan Robinson. And again, it's against a slightly different level of competition, but Tulane was good. And they played some good teams. And when you think about how he closed the season with a 17 carry, 205 yard, 4 touchdown performance to win a bowl game over Southern Cal, when he's facing some of the tougher competition, and some people are just like, facing a Pac-12 school is not tough competition. But when you're facing these Power 5 schools and you're putting up that kind of score, it highlights that it's not really a competition element that's allowing you to generate some of these numbers, right? So it ends up huge numbers overall. He finishes with 47 college catches. His 2.0 yards per route over the final year is up there at the top of the class as well. And, I don't think that he's the same level of receiver. I don't think that he is the same type of long run threat that a Jahmyr Gibbs is, for example. But, he could be the 2nd best pure runner in this class after Bijan Robinson. And one of the plays that we got to see in preseason here, we want to be sure that we don't overstate what we see in the preseason. And yet some of these guys who are flashing, and when they're demonstrating the exact same thing that they demonstrated in college, I do think that that's relevant. And it's encouraging to see. He has a 33-yard touchdown run in the 2nd week of preseason where, he hurdles multiple defenders at the line of scrimmage without slowing down. And you think about, again, kind of this contrast, and I don't want to continue to pile on Najee Harris, but Harris is one of these guys, very athletic and does vault a lot of players. And that part of it is really cool. But in almost all of those cases, right, he stops, he jumps over the guy, he stops, and then somebody else comes and tackles him. Yeah. Right? He doesn't go for 33 yards and a touchdown because he didn't even break stride.
Yeah.
Spears did it so fluidly, so effortlessly. That transition to the NFL level, and again, you're not necessarily facing the star defenders from the opposing team, all of that kind of thing. But I love how he fits as an elite complement to Derrick Henry. I think he's going to have more standalone value than people are projecting. But even if he doesn't, and it's certainly possible that the team will come out there and just give the ball to Henry every single time, as the season goes along, he's going to be somebody who is always in the mix to jump out and start being that guy with standalone value. And then certainly in the case where Derrick Henry gets hurt like he did 2 years ago, I think we'll see a very different Titans offense than we did then. Spears is going to go out and be a league winner for you. If that happens, you want to make sure you have some exposure. Again, in the right situation, at the right prices, we like Spears a lot.
And the other part as well, Shawn, I know teams are going to want to win all season long, but if this team is doing well as the season starts, they are projected to, they're not the favorites, but second to the Jaguars to potentially win that division. And with that in mind, if you're thinking about this team potentially thinking if they have a run in the playoffs, it is going to be a situation where they do need to try and save Henry for that portion as well. So I think there's ways that he can work, and you mentioned the standalone value. So very, very interested there. We'll move in now to the next portion, the mid-range portion of this, Shawn. And I did say I was going to take the guy basically at the top of the list every time. This is the one where it's not the guy who's at the top of the list. So you have 4 other names to guess. You're probably going to guess it straight away. You've already mentioned the running back who is in front of him here. Who is my guy in second list?
So I'm thinking you are going to take Jaylen Warren.
That is it. It's Jaylen Warren. A lot of the same information that we're after talking there about Spears, I think, fits here. And again, it's not to beat on Najee Harris, but in terms of efficiency and what he's done, I think he's been kept going by the receptions that he got in Ben Roethlisberger's, final season there, and that's not repeatable moving forward here. I think with the team taking in Jaylen Warren, I think we could see that move happen sooner than people are expecting. And I think, again, everything that we've seen in the preseason has looked pretty positive. The other part, Shawn, you note this in the article, is in terms of the Steelers and their offensive line last year and run blocking schemes, and how maybe we'll see Warren move in here and use some of that efficiency to. I think we could be 6 weeks into the season and this is no longer a competition to who is the starting running back. I think it could straight up just be Warren.
And so when we're talking about making a bet on a backup, I mean, this looks like it could be a pure committee situation, because last year Warren was so much more dynamic than Harris. He averaged almost a yard more per attempt simply before contact, right? And the thing that we've had trouble with Harris is his ability to get to and through the offensive line. Despite the tested athleticism, he struggles to make that transition and to get into the secondary where he could really potentially do some damage, kind of in the mold of a Derrick Henry type, where if he could actually get downhill, then that combination of size and athleticism would potentially be scary for opposing defenses, but he just doesn't get downhill. And one of the ways that we can see that, you look at next gen's yards over expected, and Harris was the 4th worst qualifying back in the league last year. I mean, he was worse than Ezekiel Elliott. And so that's a pretty bad sign for you. I mentioned Jaylen Warren's pre-contact ability, and listeners know that that's a big part for me because it does allow you then to get into the secondary. It allows you to have that profile where your yard per carry average could be, closer to the 5 range as opposed to the sub 4 range. But it's not the only thing that we're looking for, right? The flip side of that is he broke tackles at almost a 17% rate, which, I mean, those are truly elite numbers. He had a 23% evasion rate, which is going to be at the top of the NFL. Now, to sustain that on a full workload, like you will be getting from guys such as a Nick Chubb, for example, that's a very different thing to try and accomplish. But when Warren was in the game and he was touching the ball, he was one of the best running backs in the entire NFL last season. Now, I don't necessarily think that he can keep that up, and that his, size, athleticism profile is underwhelming. And yet you've got to give him credit for the things he's doing on the field. And we saw that again in preseason with that 62-yard touchdown run. Now, one of the things I would recommend is, don't get, too excited by that. I mean, it wasn't that great of a 62-yard run. It was almost defensive indifference. You have a lot of guys who had the angle on him and kind of ran toward him.
There was some quicksand on that defensive side of the field, I think.
There really was. It was a poor job of tackling there. But again, we got the effort from Warren where he finishes the play and he doesn't get slowed down and try and beat like 5 guys at once by shaking his shoulders. He gets downfield, and that's what you want to do. The other element here that you really like is that Pittsburgh's offense could be extremely dynamic. And we think of the step that it looks like Kenny Pickett is taking, but that is going to flow down through all of the skill position players. We could have a ton of goal line snaps for this team. The run blocking last year was good, which was one of the reasons why Warren was successful, and one of the reasons why it is such a big flag that Najee Harris wasn't. You can pull up our advanced team stats explorer, and this will be something cool for subscribers. You get to look at this all throughout the season to see how teams are playing in so many different categories as the year goes along. But it has a filter specifically for blocking, and then you can pull out run blocking, pass blocking. Pittsburgh was the 5th best team in the NFL last year in terms of run blown block percentage, and they were the 7th best in run blocking points earned per snap. So Warren appears to be in a very favorable situation this year. He's got some standalone value. It does look like it could be a pure committee. The Steelers are actually having to answer a ton of questions about will it be a committee or could it even be a Warren show? They've said very emphatically that no, it's going to be Najee Harris. But I mean, it's a similar kind of dynamic to the Chiefs where, you know, you've got to prop up Clyde Edwards-Helaire right up until the point where you've completely given up. And this is almost like the quarterback situations where you've got to prop that guy up until you capitulate entirely. We could be close to that point with Najee Harris. Jaylen Warren in that case would be, I reference him in this article as being the easiest click in fantasy. I mean, Jaylen Warren, if he ended up being the starter, is going to be, you know, a 4th, 5th round value.
Yep.
And that's even without considering, you know, how players can get hurt. And so you have a lot of different ways to win with Jaylen Warren.
Yeah, and that's the difference. I do think with the Henry side of things, when we talked previously about Spears, I think without injury, it could be hard for him to force himself to be the lead back over Henry. I think that's going to be very, very challenging. But I can see a path here for Warren to surpass Harris as the season moves along here. Shawn, before we do get into the final part of the list, the top tier guys from 5 through 1, just want to mention over the years the hit rate in terms of who Shawn has had on this list. And, you know, there'll be people here who may not be playing fantasy as long as some of these names that we mentioned, but there's players here who, when they hear these names, are going to have, you know, good feelings flowing through their bodies, I'm sure. So 2015, we had Devontae Freeman's breakout season. 2016, Melvin Gordon. 2017, Kareem Hunt and Alvin Kamara. 2018, James White, Tariq Cohen and Chris Carson. 2019, Eckler and Miles Sanders. We had James Robinson and Antonio Gibson. 2020, James Conner, Devin Singletary, and Rashad Penny, Shawn, in 2021. And those names, particularly Singletary and Penny, that season held a pretty fun time in some of our playoff stretches there with those two guys. So that was a particularly fun one. And last year we had Kenneth Walker in there, Raheem Mostert obviously had a nice run. Jerick McKinnon's legs started to, the restless leg there, he was back moving nice and sharply. And then we had Tyler Algier over 1,000 yards. So Shawn has been smashing on these each and every year. Has to be my number one pick in this round. It's somebody who we've talked about for many years. His price obviously this year has come down to actually fit him into this category, which at this point of his career, and I can see with the trade happening and things like that, where people may want to be out or not as in on DeAndre Swift. But in terms of everything that is going for him and moving into this Eagles offense and how good we know he can be and has been, and I know there's been some injury issues, he's missed time. Last year, I think people got a lot of disheartened watching as Jamal Williams rushed in for touchdown after touchdown after touchdown. I believe at the end of the season, I think he did break Barry Sanders' rushing touchdown record for the Lions as the season went on. So that was a bit of an anomaly. But we did see Swift even last season break off huge chunk runs, get tackled inside the 5, tackled inside the 10, and then obviously he didn't get into the end zone on those. But you move him into this offense now, which is the best running offense in the NFL. You have so many threats that it is impossible to kind of cover them all off, and you have Swift now in a range where you mentioned, auto picking or the easiest click in fantasy. Swift, maybe that for me here. We missed out on him in the main event, but we can still say that he's the easiest click.
We did miss out. We got his teammate, which emphasizes just how much talent this backfield does have.
Yeah.
Because, the third guy in Kenneth Gainwell is someone who is very trendy right now. Gainwell was on the list last year and was one of the misses. So it's interesting how these players can occasionally hit a year late. You got to have them on the year that they score the big points. So that part is always interesting. But we look at Swift, and here is a guy who averaged 2.9 yards before contact alone last year, right? Almost 3 yards just before contact, which, more or less makes him Ezekiel Elliott or Leonard Fournette's entire rushing experience. He's the best pre-contact runner in all of football. He's been that for his entire career. And because of that, he's one of the only backs, and I would include Jonathan Taylor, J.K. Dobbins, Breece Hall, probably as those guys with the shot to average 6 yards a carry, which is going to give you the chance to put up big numbers on a slightly lesser workload. You're going to have those big plays that score you touchdowns. Ideally, you're going to have scrimmage yards that inflate the total number, again, beyond what you're just getting as a rusher. Those profiles tend to be fairly strongly correlated. Swift last season, right? When he comes back from that injury from week 10 on, he only gets 39% of the snaps and still averages over 13 points per game, which is crazy. It's crazy. And you say, well, I mean, the Lions generated a lot of total running back points. That's one of the reasons why we're willing to take the risk on Jahmyr Gibbs early in drafts, even though he looks to be in, probably a pure committee with David Montgomery. And so some people have questions about that ADP if you're going to take a guy that early who's in a committee. But the Lions potentially put up a huge total number of points, and yet you move over to the Eagles, and it's interesting because last season they had the third lowest receiving EP to the running backs. That part isn't good, and yet everything that you've heard from the team this offseason is that Swift's addition is specifically to open up that part of the attack, to give Jalen Hurts an additional weapon, to give the offense additional wrinkles. I mean, I think that one of the things that we're looking at here with all of these rushing quarterbacks is that the teams are going to want them to still do that. They're going to want those guys to use the dynamism that they possess to do things like keep drives going. The third down value, the fourth down value for these players within the context of offenses and the new, all of the evolution that we've gotten defensively. And Ben and I did we did 3 or 4 Stealing Bananas episodes on that, if anyone is interested. But when you think through those things, I don't think that the rushing quarterbacks are going to stop rushing by any stretch. But I do think they're going to be a little bit more tactical. They're going to be a little bit more precision strikes in terms of how they do that. And if they can run plays here where we get the ball to DeAndre Swift in space as opposed to having Jalen Hurts take hits, that's what you want. You say, well, I mean, Swift hasn't held up that well to that. The shoulder injury is an issue, the ankle issue, all of those types of things with him. He probably is one of the more fragile running backs in the NFL. That's factored into his price, right? So we're looking at that, and you think about what the Eagles want, what their incentives are. If they get DeAndre Swift hurt, they have Rashad Penny and Kenneth Gainwell. If they get Jalen Hurts hurt, then their team is simply not going to be competing for the Super Bowl championship in the same way. So you can see what the incentives are there. They talked a lot about that. You look at what Swift brings to the table. One of the things that I mentioned here is that last season, the Lions were 5th worst in blown block percentage on running plays. The Eagles were 2nd best. There are some elements of moving from the Lions to the Eagles that are not perfect for running back scoring, but there are some elements about moving from the Lions to the Eagles that gives you this chance to be a monster scorer. And we think about what Miles Sanders did last year, and Miles Sanders is good. I think he's always been even a tiny bit underrated, but Miles Sanders is not DeAndre Swift. Now, that doesn't mean that DeAndre Swift is going to take his full role. They have more depth this year. They have more playmaking ability. They appear to be more comfortable with Gainwell this year than they were last year. So you want to go into it with eyes wide open, but the ceiling for DeAndre Swift is a back who next year is drafted at the 2-3 turn. Mm-hmm. When you're getting that in round 7 and round 8, it's very difficult to ignore, in part because when you get a player like that at those prices, you have some other options, right? You've made 6 other picks. Your entire draft doesn't come down to whether or not DeAndre Swift hits, but if he does hit, your team is going to be very difficult to deal with. One
question for you to finish off on DeAndre Swift. When you were doing the list, did it almost feel like it was too easy to have DeAndre Swift? Were you looking in other ways to see should he even qualify because he shouldn't be getting drafted in this spot in the draft?
Well, I mentioned in the intro to the final piece that we've always had round 6 backs on the list before, because you think about some of the tenets of zero RB, you think about what kind of a soft version of it would be with 4 wide receivers and an elite tight end. So you've made 5 picks where you've addressed your starting wide receivers, you've addressed your flex positions, you've addressed that tight end position. So you're going to have a field tilter there. You're going to have that impact tournament winner at tight end. Obviously, you could have worked an elite QB into there, but especially in deep, intense contests, that's not necessarily what we're always looking to do. But you get through 5 rounds, and if you then want to make that pick at running back. That's always been very much something that we would still consider zero RB, which even then, that's kind of beside the point. We're not trying to draft in a way that like we can say is zero RB. We're trying to win leagues. But this year, the round 6 guys are so high end, and I've made such clear-cut arguments for them in individual articles on the site that I didn't want to just rehash that, or I didn't want to take the easy way out. And so round 7 was the first group that I was really considering for the list this year. And it felt too perfect, right? I mean, it's the way to finish it, is if you can get DeAndre Swift as your number 1 zero RB candidate for 2023, it just feels like this magical way to wrap up the group. There are some other good names in there, and I think we're going to have a variety of hits from the list, different levels. You mentioned some of the guys from the past, and it's always interesting to see these players who did have that flash of glory. I mean, James Robinson, somebody who's having a hard time sticking on rosters anymore, but he was the overall running back 5. Mm-hmm. People always think, you can't, these guys who maybe are good but not great, these guys who are in good situations but not perfect situations, these guys that are drafted a little bit later, these guys who have a few warts, I mean, maybe they can come through and give you some weekly scores at a time that matters. And that's not to be underestimated. That helps a lot. But we tend to think, they can't really go out there and be the true league winners. I mean, James Robinson, before his injury, was that good. The RB5 in 2020, that was just a couple of years ago, right? So it's always fun to see some of those names. And even for the guys whose careers kind of flashed out too quickly, you love for them that they got to have that moment of glory.
Yeah, and it can be a case, and what we're looking for here, even if it is a flash, is to have the impact this year based on ADP and how that can work out. It's not essentially, you mentioned earlier, it's not the same as Dynasty where we need this to happen every single year. Another name, Shawn, that would kind of fit in with that would be Philip Lindsay, as he kind of come in with a rocket strapped to his back. But again, when you are that undrafted player, or if you have injuries, the chances are a little bit limited. And when the competition comes in of higher draft capital, and that can be very, very challenging long term in their career. But exciting to talk through the list today. I will be linking all 3 pieces in the show notes for this episode. So if you haven't checked them out yet, I'm sure all the subscribers at this point have read through them. But if you haven't, head on over and check those out. I did mention, make sure you are following along on Twitter. I can't promise that this will happen. We're trying to do something pretty exciting that will be over on the RotoViz YouTube side of things, potentially over this coming weekend. So do stay tuned for that. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.